And from there, the Aceh start using the same similar concept of having a 9-fold seal matrix of seals. And that became inspiration as well for the swatau dish. So, while generally the exhibition invites the visitors to see how the Malay world connects within their own realm, but also with the wider part of the world, for this talk, I will be focusing on the artifacts originated from Malaysia to fit the theme of today's roundtable discussion. The artifacts from Malaysia featured in the exhibition, and the exhibition catalogue shows Malaysia is a space of convergence shaped by the movement of people, goods, religion, particularly Islamic faith, languages, and ideas. One example I often return to is the Dalail al-Khairat. In the context of transmission of visual arts from the Islamic world to the Malay world to the network of religious scholars of ulama. For example, this one is from Terengganu, connection between Terengganu and the Hijaz. You can see the one with gold illuminated Dalail copy is from Terengganu, and the next to it is actually from the Ottoman period. You can see the transmission of the images, the illustration from the Kaabah in the colorful one, the Ottoman, and the next one in the gold. So they maintain the whole concept, but they included their own way of illuminating the pages with the way of how Terengganu, Terengganu wood carvings, and that you can see in the palace and the mosque in Terengganu. But the whole concept they copied from the manuscripts of Dalail al-Khairat from the Ottoman and also earliest one. It's a tradition of copying and transition from one manuscript to another throughout the Islamic world. So this is one copy from Terengganu. Because most of the ulama travel to Hijaz, Mecca and Madinah and studied there. They're not just learning Islamic religion, but they're also learning Islamic sciences such as astronomy or Ilm al-Falak. And they also studied art such as calligraphy, known as Istanbul calligraphy, and also the illuminations. Another example is the Quran of Terengganu, known as the Golden Mushaf of Terengganu. This one is currently displayed at the Ocean Deck 6 exhibition. So you can see with the demand of the ruler of Terengganu, this one during Baginda Omar of Terengganu, who's a ruler between 6th and 9th Sultan of Terengganu. And you can see the pattern, everything reflects the traditional art of the region, and especially focusing on the state of Terengganu. The use of Golden Mushaf might come inspired from the tradition of Islamic world. So you can see here, this is also from the Ottoman Quran during the 17th century, 1676, the gold illuminated Quran. Usually you can find gold illuminated Quran belongs to ruler, while others might not have any gold illuminated pages. And besides that, we also have transmission of calligram. You can see here, this is an example from Mughal emperor, Mughal dynasty in India, where they use calligram that representing Ali bin Abi Talib, the son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad. And you can find here is the lion of Ali. And when it came to the Malay world, you can find two examples here, one from Cirebon. You can see the blue one, small lion, a small tiger, and from Kelantan as well. So you can see in other world, lion is seen connected to Ali bin Abi Talib. But when it came to reach Malay world, it changes to tiger because it's more nature here. We cannot find lion in Malaysia, but you can only find tiger. So you switch the animal from lion to tiger, but keep the same theme or concept of protection using Quranic verses. For example, the one in the black tirai, the black hanging panel, is written, the calligram is written Surah As-Saf, which means a protection from Allah and speedy victory. Trades also contributed to the trans-regional adaptation of folk belief and traditions. The tiger bells and the beads, for instance, were very important trade materials in Sabah and Sarawak. Some of the beads came from China, some came from Europe, and became part of the dress and traditions of various ethnicities in both states. The bronze tiger bells were imported from China and worn as amulets among the people of Borneo, Sulawesi, and southern Philippines. So here you can find an example. This one I went to Borneo Cultural Museum since we don't have so many objects representing Borneo for this project. So with the kindness of Jabatan Museum Sarawak, we managed to get a picture to include it into the exhibition catalogue. Well, we try to connect the beads with the Lutuan, which belongs to the southern part of Philippines, Lanao del Sur, which is somewhere in Mindanao. And you can find the next one is the tiger bell, is probably from Eurasia. And you can find it not just from Malay world, but you can find the same thing in Central Asia as well. So one of the reasons why I'm looking at the trans-regional approach for this exhibition, because in both the museum and academic world, there has traditionally been greater interest in the trans-regional connection of the western side of the Indian Ocean, particularly through the lenses of history and art history. In contrast, the eastern side of the Indian Ocean is often overlooked or marginalized. So the Ocean That Speaks is therefore an important project for me and for the museum as well, one that allows shift in focus towards region and perspective beyond the dominant scholarly lenses. This trans-regional approach challenges the idea that history must be nationalistic. It makes space for exchanges and for connection. It allows us to ask who else was part of this story. It's about seeing ourselves not isolated, but as deeply connected with other regions. In order to produce this exhibition, I see my role as a storyteller and producer of history by studying the artifacts and transferring them to the people in form of an exhibition. The caption of each artifacts and the information panels in the gallery and the exhibition catalogue help visitors and readers to understand more about the artifacts. At least that is our hope for this project. Of course, giving tours in the gallery allows the curator to share more with the public. I think maybe some of you have attended my tour, so that's how I share my knowledge with you guys. Something that I cannot put in the book, something that I cannot put in the captions. So sometimes you have to bear with me for 2 hours in the gallery. And in developing in this exhibition, I rely heavily on the works of scholars, particularly historians and art historians whose research provided essential context and insight. So with 10 of them contributed to the exhibition catalogue, including Dr. Sumit Mandal. And we also have Dr. Annabelle, Dr. Arafat, Dr. Sarah Japii, Dr. Derek Hang, who else? Derek Hang, few more names that I might forget. But you can have a look at the catalogue. You can see 10 names, very, very important people, including Leonard Andaya and Barbara Andaya as well. So, learning through their research, for instance, Dr. Sumit Mandal book, Becoming Arabs, Creole Histories and Modern Identity in the Malay World, helped me understand the role of Hadrami community as cultural agents in Indonesia, such as the development of batik in places like Pekalongan. So my background is not in history. So I rely, as a curator, we rely on the researchers, we rely on the academicians who came, give talks, and we attended. Or sometimes we send them a list of questions because we don't know something or we need answers. So when Dr. Sumit first came, like almost 10 years, we have been known for like 10 years. So he will bring his student. And that is where we had the opportunity to engage discussion with him and the students, since I'm not from the background history of art and history. So it is very important to develop this project, and as well as attending conferences. So as a storyteller, there are very few important things that I've learned to consider. Lesson drawn from my friends in Sabah and Sarawak. One of the most significant is the importance of inclusivity. In the Islamic Arts Museum Malaysia, we have little material from Borneo related to Islamic material. Most of it are from Patani or other region, Indonesia especially. So we try one of the most significant importance, ensuring the voices and histories and cultural expression of diverse community are represented with respect. So it's, for example, if you go to the gallery, you can find Parang Ilang and Mandal. That is the only representation from Borneo. We also have representation from Mindanao in other cases. Their perspective reminded me that storytelling in a museum is not just about how we show, but also about how we get to be seen and heard. So I would like to end this short presentation by inviting everyone to look at our country as a historical meeting point of exchanges and diverse cultures, ideas, and artistic traditions. My task was only to connect the dots of network between religious scholars, artisans, traders, and patronages. By tracing the connection across the Indo-Ocean from Middle East, especially the Muslim in the Hijaz, the letters, the dresses, and also the Quran in the one that we have in the gallery. All this has connection with Malaysia, how we all are actually connect to one another and we exchange ideas. One example is the Quran. For example, the Quran from Terengganu just now, you can find the same example in Quran in Jawa. They got inspiration because there's a movement of material and movement of idea. So for me, this is important not only in understanding the past, but also in shaping a more inclusive and interconnected sense of Malaysian identity today. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. And I do have to say that's a very impressive perspective from the position as a storyteller. And I guess I should first introduce the first speaker of today, Yern. So Yern is a researcher and team member at Malaysia Design Archive, the MDA. His research examines historical and political perspectives of food and labor through the lens of hunger and modernity. Some of his past topics include Malaysian hawker movements and the limits of state milk projects during the Cold War period. Previously, Yern was a senior research associate at ASEAN Research Center, Asia School of Business. On the side, he runs program at NDA and assists with the implementation of community archival projects. So Yern, let me hand over the floor to you.
Well, this isn't my talk, but I will probably just swap it to. This is not about food, clearly. Cool. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to set a timer before I forget the time. But thank you so much for inviting me to do this. Just a quick note, I'm as mentioned, I'm a researcher. So although I am part of MDA, I'm not specifically an archivist, unlike some of the more skilled people in the team. So I will approach it from sort of like an historical perspective. But then I guess what I want to do with this presentation is to kind of think about how the different ways in which we can read and use sources in the telling of narratives, as the previous speakers have done just now. So this is called the milking of the modern state, which is a pun of the making of the modern state, because I hope to do this presentation in a tongue-in-cheek manner, and then my friends were very helpful in the suggestions. Thank you so much for that. So before I go on, let me just begin with one of the objects that I've always been fixated upon this ever since I've been to MDA. So MDA has this collection of ice cream wrappers. We have like 80 to 100 of them, is a lot. That's collected by this one man who, I'm not so sure what was his relationship with ice cream wrappers, but basically when he passed away, essentially we were able to receive and collect the collection from the family members of the collector. So, but I think one thing that I would like to talk about is what kinds of questions we can ask with something as simple as the ice cream wrappers. Like we've seen just now, like the very elaborate artifacts and objects in the 19th century, as Marina has just talked about. But what about this? Something as simple as this, very pixelated as well, because I think I didn't realize how small the file size was. I think one thing that I was immediately struck by, aside from the image, like the typical imagery of tropical fruits, snowflakes, is the list of ingredients that was presented on the wrapper itself. So we have gula, pepperja susu, minyak sayuran, yada yada. What I don't really care about the rest of that, but what I wanted to focus in on the most is something called pepperja susu, milk solids. What are milk solids? So this is the thing that I am really interested in exploring, because kind of like the notion of turning milk into something that is solid, and also is this notion of like mastery over biological life, which is milk, and that in the process of translation, it turns it into a particular commodity for human consumption. So, and this actually milk, one thing to note is that the ice cream wrappers, though the dates were not determined, they were like basically peppered throughout the 20th century since independence. So one thing to note is that like milk solids were a very important feature of colonial economies since 19th century, or since the early 1900s in Southeast Asia, and I'll go on a little bit more. But before I touch on about this miraculous milk solids, let me just talk a little bit about the local milk practices in Malaya at that time. So we have long history of Tamil and Punjabi milk vendors who travel from South Asia to here bringing their zebu cattle, and but a big part of it is that these dairy vendors were a significant part of the life roles of the communities back then, because milk was important not only as food but also as cultural practices as aspects of religious worship, and cattle as themselves as well need no explanation for that. Meanwhile, while the significance of milk in Tamil and South Asian practices were uncontested, there were a lot of conversations around whether Malay communities at that time consumed milk. So William Maxwell, the secretary of the Strait Settlements in the 19th century, was translating these little proverbs. You've probably seen them in schools before, Pisan sa ikat susu sebelah na, tanda sepakat makan sama-sama. I'm very bad at Malay pronunciation, but I guess just one thing to note is that these translations were used by Geoffrey Pakiam, a Singaporean historian, to kind of explore the ways in which, while we might not have documented sources of milk consumption as far back as 19th century with Malay communities, these little tidbits, these little texts kind of say something about the ways in which bovine milk was present in Malay lives at the time. And then this will go on to be debated in the 20th century, because there'll be a lot of people who will be like, no lah, Malay people didn't drink milk, because you know why? They only use oxen or bovines to plow the fields for rice fields. And then, so there's a lot of conversations about this, which I'll get back to later. But again, this is just to establish that milk in some ways were already present as a local practice in Malaysia. However, the scale of the milk consumption, milk production with these local practices were nothing compared to the abundance of ice cream and the abundance of different kinds of milk products that were already at play in 20th century Malaya. So what gives? So all of the milk that we've consumed since late 19th century, early 20th century were actually imported. We don't have actually dreams of cattle ranchers farming across Malaya. We actually don't have that. We actually don't have that many cattle that can actually produce at such a scale. So we've been basically consuming condensed milk, in the form of kopi and teh susu in coffee shops, and thanks to the importations of the colonial economy and the donations of philanthropy organizations, powdered milk was distributed and donated to maternal clinics in Malaya, because mothers at that time needed powdered milk to be able to feed their babies with sufficient nutrition. So to point a bit more about this, milk was actually one of the largest share of food imports at that time in the 1960s. Say, milk trade alone, I think, was around 74 million Malaysian dollars, and the total, whereas the total share of animal food stuff imported at that time was about 180 million, including literal meats and also live animals. So milk occupied a third of the imports at the time. So this goes to show how important milk was to kind of the Malaysian foodways already since the early 1900s. So one of the things that I want to go back to is this idea, the notion of milk solids. And what are milk solids? I mean, it seems very normal for us today, but milk solids are essentially a result of many technologies of preservations and transformations of milk. So we have this milk originally with a short lifespan, because it wouldn't be able to last outside in America, much less Malaysian tropical weather. So what happened was that milk businesses, as they continued to accumulate more and more surpluses, depended upon developing new technologies to kind of extend the shelf lives of such milk, and and because of that, we came about condensed milk, powdered milk, all kinds of technologies and programs that were able to kind of transform milk into this particular commodity that was able to not only be stored for a longer shelf life, but it was able to be transported away from the global north all the way down to parts of Asia and Africa and the global south. So this was in many ways a particular marvel of like, first of all, regional histories, but also a marvel of technology in overcoming the biological limitations of milk. And this kind of like implied this particular mastery over life, because cattle at that time had become creatures of the state. Now, like, state governments had significantly transformed cattle into mere numbers, like values and nutrients to be measured, produced, and reproduced all across the world. So, and these techniques of milk preservation were especially important during the world wars, because, as you know, one of the most important things about the wars were supply lines. They needed to make sure that food supply chains continued to be distributed across different parts of the world, so that soldiers could survive the extended staging battles of the war. Like, as we know, in 1950 through the BRICS plan, one of the main ways that the British government sought to contain, the British military administration sought to contain the Malayan communist insurgents, was to cut off food supply by relocating squatter agricultures to different parts of controlled and regulated new villages. So here's a picture of a still of a British troop basically pouring milk paste into boiling water to reconstitute milk, which is quite gross, like if you think about it now. But this was actually a very significant part of like the kind of like military supply chains practices at that time, not only with milk but with other kinds of food as well. So after the war, we come about this new problem. Milk produced too much milk. And milk, surprisingly enough, was considered too big to fail at the time, because they had so much capital, so much production, so many people invested in part of these economies that the global north countries, America, Switzerland, Netherlands, and England as well to an extent, could not afford to let these things fall apart. The Great Depression was already a sign of like this kind of like the milk supply chains becoming unruly, because like people started dumping milk because milk prices crashed completely. So like there was this crisis where like a lot of the countries were not able to balance supply and demand at that time. So what was the solution that they thought about when they were trying to solve this problem of like too much production and too little demand? So they just opened new markets in Asia and Africa law. So in many ways, Asia and Africa became the next business frontier for a lot of these dairy businesses. So what they were like basic, and apart from that too, one parallel discourse came to benefit the interests of dairy businesses. So at that time, we know that there exists the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. So these were both like global organizations that were part of this new global political consensus. And what they were advocating for was the production and consumption of milk across the world, because milk, given that it was rich in proteins, fats, all kinds of vitamins, minerals, and was consumed by global north all the time, it was thought to be this miraculous food that needed to be given to the poor, like the poor and desolate countries in developing countries all across the world. And this was already there was already a precedent, because a lot of the Red Cross organizations, like Catholic organizations, various kinds of social and philanthropic organizations, were already donating a lot of these milk supplies to Asia and Africa, because there was just simply too much milk. And then turns out you could, since you have so much of this product, why don't you do out of goodwill donate these foodstuffs to parts of the world that needed it. So the Malayan government at this time was so convinced by this narrative. They were like, oh, this is very, very important. We can save our impoverished communities time. Because at that time, Malaysian government was very concerned, because they were coming off the throes of Japanese occupation, World War II, and they were in need of ways to kind of overcome the crisis of malnutrition and poverty, not in various parts of communities across the peninsula. So this was considered a solution. So not only did they started bringing in a lot of these foreign dairy businesses from America, Australia, New Zealand, Netherlands, Switzerland, like Nestle, Dutch Lady, and so on and so forth. And what they did was that, so they brought in the factories that could that had the reconstitution and milk preservation technologies. What they did was that they built these factories in PJ, Selangor, and basically in Malaysia. they imported milk solids from New Zealand and Australia to reconstitute it into all kinds of milk products and ice creams. This is why even like when we were children, there was so much milk ready, even though we literally produced none of them effectively. So a big part of it is that we were essentially part of this larger transregional commodity supply chain that is quite haunting in many ways, because we were so, and in many ways, this was a very compelling imposition of milk into Malaysian foodways. And that this is a project that had already started during the reign of British Empire in the early 1900s. So, but apart from that too, was that the Malaysian government wanted to also build their own dairying ranches. So they basically located dairy colonies in Batu Ara and Pantai Negeri Sembilan in the early 1960s. They basically convinced Tamil dairy vendors to become cooperative members of these dairy colonies to start their own pioneer dairying businesses. So, but the thing is, it was very problematic in many ways, because there were so many problems that they had to overcome. I think political anthropologist James C. Scott talks about this concept of high modernism, where states in the 20th century had a very strong faith in technologies, programmatics, and science to kind of like tackle all sorts of like problems that were rendered legible to the state. So in many, so what the state was trying to tackle was this like nationwide hunger that was measurable at that time, because like our like apparatus of like our measuring and statistical apparatus have become so sophisticated that we were able to in some ways measure and like try and like think about how best we could manage hunger. So, but then there were other problems as well. First of all, these the Frisian cattle, they would die in our climate. They could not survive. They were the highest producing milk yield. And then the Zebu cattle, they were the hardier ones that could survive a tropical climate. But they could produce no milk. Like, in fact, part of the reason why milk adulteration was such a thing was because vendors really had to stretch milk supplies for all sorts of users. So what they wanted to do was to kind of like manipulate the genetic potential of these cattle. So basically they imported semen from India and Pakistan. They got red Sahiwal cattle and the red Sindhi cattle and Sahiwal cattle to interbreed. They basically threw all the sperm like seeds across the peninsula. It was very horrific, because what happened was that it was completely uncontrolled. There was no like rhyme or reason. Like there was no rhyme or reason as to why they did this. They just had this faith that as long as we keep crossbreeding them, eventually we'll have this perfect super cow that was able to withstand the tropical weather and also to produce a lot of milk for us. But and there were also all sorts of other problems. As I will point here, the lalang, cattle don't eat them. So they were native to Asia, and by this time they were already considered an invasive species in the States and the rest of the world. And they were so like problematic for like cattle rearing that because they would grow on hardy soil, they would spread quickly, and they would kill all competitors by producing a sort of chemical that could like hamper the growth of plants around them. So there were a lot of problems with it because we have a lot of lalang. So how do we overcome this? So this, I wouldn't go too much into this, but basically rest assured that like there were a lot of problems with the environment that like the Department of Veterinary Services in Malaysia tried to overcome. But there was also another significant issue. Many Malaysians had a fraught relationship in the taste of milk. A lot of state veterinary officers started discussing like, hey, why don't Malay people drink milk? I mean, these were all Malay state officers. They were like, oh, because they were expensive, or because like, Malay people just don't drink them. But then, as Geoffrey Parkham has shown, the story was much more complicated. So in many ways, milk consumption was very patchy, and also not to mention that they completely ignored Tamil vendors' like presence in this. They were just like, oh, Malay people at that time, because that was one of the biggest concerns in terms of overcoming malnutrition for the Department of Veterinary Services. So there were other kind of like social and cultural problems as well, and they just assumed that because people like condensed milk and people like powdered milk, that liquid milk was like going to be popular in Malaysian audiences. But condensed milk was like popular because it was freaking sweet and tasty compared to like just liquid milk altogether. So in many ways, milk had garnered this like very fraught place in the Malaysian foodways. Like sweetened condensed milk was like, I mean, yes, it was tasty, and then powdered milk was used by everyone. And then as we know, ice cream has proven to be a very popular treat for many people. So at that time,